era importante tener el color correcto en la presentación de Bern Frischer, que nos acompaña en esta primera plática magistral. Les daré una pequeña introducción a su trabajo y a su biografía, y luego los dejaré con él. Es líder en arqueología virtual, autor de 7 libros impresos, 3 libros electrónicos y decenas de artículos en patrimonio virtual, clásico y supervivencia del mundo clásico. Es el editor fundador de la revista Digital Applications to Archaeology and Cultural Heritage y es la primera revista arbitrada en línea donde los científicos publican modelos interactivos en 3D. Hizo la licenciatura en estudios clásicos en la Wesleyan University y en 1971 terminó su PhD en estudios clásicos por la Universidad de Heidelberg. Ha enseñado estudios clásicos en la Universidad de California de Los Ángeles desde 1976 hasta 2004 y de 2004 a 2013 fue profesor en Historia del Arte y Clásicas en la Universidad de Virginia. Desde agosto del 2013 ha sido profesor de arqueoinformática en la Escuela de Informática de la Universidad de Indiana. También ha dirigido el departamento de Virtual World Heritage Laboratory. En este laboratorio la misión es aplicar las herramientas de 3D para simular edificios de patrimonio cultural. Ha dirigido también diferentes excavaciones en Roma, por ejemplo en la Villa de Horacio, financiado por la Academia Americana en Roma. En 2005, Bernard Frischer recibió el premio de la Sociedad Internacional de Sistemas Virtuales al ser el pionero en estudios multimedia. Así que, sin más, los dejo con Bernard Frischer, que nos honra con su presencia. Muchas gracias. Thank you, Barry.
Thank you for a very nice introduction and the invitation to speak to you today. Ernesto, could you turn that light a little bit away from the screen because it's affecting the screen, just a little bit. I think after all the work we did to make the projection right. Oh, okay. Well, that's even better, if you don't mind. Fantastic. Well, again, thank you for the nice introduction and especially for the invitation to be here today. I've been to Mexico quite a bit, to Oaxaca, to Chiapas, and other parts of your beautiful country, but except for the airport, never to Mexico City. And this museum for me is a kind of a mecca of museums. As I wrote to my wife this morning, I did a quick tour yesterday, and this museum is to Mesoamerican art and archaeology as the Vatican Museum is, I think, to classical art and archaeology. So I'm very, very happy to be here. And I'm here to talk to you about 3D technologies and how they can be useful to us as archaeologists. And I think it's a good time to discuss this subject because we really live in a golden age of 3D modeling of cultural heritage. 10 years ago, what we can do today at little or no expense and with excellent results was either absolutely impossible to do at all or could only be done if you had a lot of money at your disposal. For example, in 2006, we scanned and modeled the Laocoon in the Vatican museums, where I've worked a lot in the past, and it cost us $25,000 to do this, money that was generously given to us by the Crest Foundation in New York. And that actually seemed like a good price because the very first statue ever scanned was the David of Michelangelo in Florence. That was scanned by Marc Lavoie in 1998-99, and it cost $1 million, which was donated to the project by Paul Allen, one of the co-founders of Microsoft. So we went from $1 million in, say, 1999 to a mere $25,000 for one statue in 2006. So the price was coming down. And then In 2011, we modeled the Augustus of Prima Porta in the Vatican Museum, and we were very happy that the price of that project went down even more to a mere $10,000, which is still a lot of pesos and a lot of dollars. But for at least the last 3 years, it has been possible to capture 3D data using standard digital cameras instead of dedicated laser or structured light scanners. And in this period, my lab has made hundreds of models of classical statues at practically no cost, such as the model you see of the famous Barberini faun in Munich, which you're seeing on the screen. And as you see in the box, the price of this project was $0. Everything that we needed to use cost nothing, assuming you had a good digital camera, which most of us have and which we can use for many things besides 3D modeling. 5 years ago, when we made the model of a statue, it was difficult to make it run in a standard web browser. Now, thanks to WebGL, there are many solutions for doing this. And again, the cost is either nothing or a trivial amount. On the slide, you've been seeing video of screen capture of our lab statue of the Roman Emperor Caligula, as well as the original statue in the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts in Richmond, Virginia. The model is running on a standard HTML web page using a WebGL solution, which our lab helped to develop. One of the nice things about this solution is you can change the illumination on the 3D model, which can be very useful. I would think, especially looking at the museum yesterday, there's so many reliefs, from Aztec reliefs, Maya reliefs, and so on. Very nice to be able to change the lighting on the model to see details that would otherwise not be very apparent. The progress which I have just reported about 3D modeling of small objects such as statues is even more impressive when it comes to buildings, archaeological sites, and entire landscapes. Now, with a drone, even a consumer-level drone, such as the one we're using here, that only costs $1,000, and a camera that attaches to it, like a GoPro, the best GoPro only costs $500, you can capture the 3D data of a structure or a landscape and its context in a matter of minutes. And here you see our drone flying over the Roman archaeological site of Cosa in Tuscany. The same photo modeling software useful in digitizing a statue can be used to make a 3D model of these larger scale cultural heritage artifacts, objects, environments. So here you see a 3D model, interactive 3D model running on the web in a standard browser, screen capture again, of that archaeological site of Cosa. And you can see that we have the overall environmental model, and there are hotspots where there are features of particular interest, and those then you can click on to more detailed models and see them. So here you're seeing the Capitolium, or the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, at the site of Cosa. Again, this costs nothing except for the roughly $2,000 one-time expense to buy the drone and to buy the camera. If 3D data capture and modeling have made great advances, then so too has distribution and display. Until consumer-level 3D printers such as the MakerBot, which you're seeing in this slide, appeared on the market several years ago, 3D printing was locked up in the specialized and very expensive domain of rapid prototyping. Now, as you can see, with a MakerBot, which costs about $2,000 or less, you can print out a model such as the Barberini faun, and the cost of the media of the resin is a couple of pennies. So for a couple of pesos, you can get this printout. And as you can see, the results are quite nice and mean that, among other things, now every student can have his or her own personal cast collection of the statues or reliefs that they're studying in an art or archaeology class. As recently as 2 years ago, if you wanted to immerse yourself in your virtual world using a head-mounted display, you had to spend over $100,000 to buy a good device like the Sensix HMD that you see on the screen. Now with the arrival of the Oculus Rift and competing products from Samsung and Sony, the cost has plunged to 1% of that or less, and it is predicted to be going much, much lower just in the next couple of years. Perhaps this kind of head-mounted display we see in the Oculus Rift could be available for $100. And I should not forget to mention in this context Google Cardboard, which has already driven the price of such devices down to a pittance by exploiting the hardware of a device which most of us already own, a cell phone. So you just get this kit for $20 from Google and assemble it, put it on your cell phone, and you have a head-mounted display that costs very, very little. All of these developments are good news for anyone who uses 3D technology, whether on an amateur or professional level. But what about innovations that pertain more specifically to us as professional archaeologists? This is what I would like to concentrate on today. Let me start by saying that the things I have discussed thus far pertain to 3D illustration and visualization, how we can more efficiently and economically capture and display 3D data. Of course, 3D illustration and visualization are quite important to us as archaeologists, but primarily insofar as they allow us to communicate or make new insights and discoveries about the artifacts, monuments, and sites we study. Let me start with some good news about communication. Last year, as Ernesto mentioned in the introduction, I started a new online journal called Digital Applications in Archaeology and Cultural Heritage, or DAACH for short. DAACH is another example of how much things have changed dramatically in the last 2 to 3 years. Before the journal started publishing, there was no online peer-reviewed journal where you could publish your 3D models as the interactive creations that they are. At best, you could publish screenshots or renderings of the model, and usually you had to publish them in a print journal in black and white, which defeats the whole purpose of making an interactive model. Now, with the launch of DAACH, you have an outlet for publishing and eventually preserving the work that you are doing in applying 3D technologies to cultural heritage. And you can see here just a typical article that's posted. You can see it's got a 3D model. This is an article about the east pediment of the Temple of Zeus at Olympia, and we've got the interactive 3D model based on a laser scan of the pediment by a group of Hungarian and German scholars. We're very proud of our editorial board, which is international and interdisciplinary. We would love to have some representatives of Mesoamerican archaeology on the board, so if you're interested, let me know. I'd be happy to add you. It goes without saying that our journal supports open access, so making your work freely available to everyone. Otherwise, if you don't use the open access option, it's closed access only to subscribers of the journal, but the good news is, since the publisher is the biggest publisher in the world, Elsevier, already hundreds of universities around the world subscribe to the journal. Of course, what we publish in DAACH is not simply 3D models. The point of the journal is to go beyond illustration and show how 3D models can be used as tools for learning something new about the past. Information scientist Colin Ware set forth general ways in which a scientific visualization, such as a 3D model of an archaeological artifact, can serve as a tool of discovery. Two are of particular interest to us: simulating experiences and running experiments. Experiments which, in the absence of a 3D visualization, would simply be impossible because of the limitations of time, space, and/or scale. That is to say, we can obviously not travel back in time to study how what is now an archaeological site looked and functioned in the past, but we can create a 3D digital model of the site and use that for surrogate time travel. Once we take this virtual voyage to a lost world of the past, we can make observations there, take measurements that will be as accurate and reliable to the extent that our 3D modeling data are accurate and reliable. Simpiricism is the term that I have coined for this method of empirical research relying on computer simulations. I believe that simpiricism will be the next big breakthrough in the application of 3D digital technologies to our field. In my remaining time today, I will present to you an example of simpirical research. It's research I've been doing for the past 3 years, focusing on my core discipline of Roman archaeology. In particular, I will talk about 2 of the most important surviving monuments of the reign of Rome's first emperor, Augustus. He ruled Rome from 30 BC to his death in 14 AD, and we're now at the end of the 2000th anniversary year of the death of Augustus, a year that has seen important scholarly conferences and exhibitions all over the Western world. In 13 BC, when Augustus returned from putting down revolts in the provinces of Gaul and Spain, he was honored with an enormous altar known as the Areopagus, or the Altar of Peace. It was finished in 9 BC, the same year that Augustus erected nearby the very first obelisk ever brought from Egypt to Rome. Eventually, later emperors brought so many obelisks from Egypt to Rome that today Rome has more obelisks than all of Egypt. The obelisk that interests us is generally known as the Montecitorio obelisk since 1792 it has stood in front of the Montecitorio Palace in Rome, which today houses the Italian Parliament. In this slide, you see a map of the ancient city. I draw your attention to the low plain to the east of the Tiber River, known as the Campus Martius, or the Field of Mars, the war god of the ancient Romans. This was swampy public land used before Augustus as a place for training the army and for holding political meetings. It was subject to the terrible floods that afflicted Rome every 10 years or so when the Tiber overflowed its banks, something it did until modern times when a great embankment was built, starting in 1890. Please keep the fact of the Tiber floods in mind as I proceed with my talk. Augustus developed this area into a beautiful public park decorated with dynastic monuments such as his monumental tomb and with temples such as the Pantheon, one of the most famous surviving temples in Rome. The area where Augustus erected the Areopagus and the obelisk is outlined in red, in the red box. The Areopagus is at number 1, the obelisk at number 2. Today, the obelisk and Areopagus have been restored, you've seen pictures of them, and re-erected elsewhere in Rome. So the original spatial and visual relationship between the monuments, of course, has been completely lost. In this slide, we see the red arrows pointing to the present-day locations of the monuments. The purple arrows now show us where these monuments stood in the ancient city. For this reason, if you want to study the alignment between the altar and the obelisk, the visual relationship of these 2 monuments, you have no choice but to make a computer simulation. You can't just go to Rome today and look at them. They're in the wrong places. In this slide, you see a video of one of the 2 simulations that we created using the computer, and I call your attention to a few important points. First, note how the obelisk stands on an extension of the axis of symmetry of the Areopagus. Second, note that the obelisk has a sphere, a globe, on top. The sphere was the pointer for a meridian which Augustus built directly to the north of the obelisk, a great meridian, one of the longest in world history, 55 meters long. In the video, you see the shadow of the sphere and the obelisk on the raised platform of the meridian. So this is the meridian. Whoops, wrong way. Here's the meridian. Here's the shadow of the obelisk. At noon every day of the year, the shadow of the obelisk would fall on the meridian and tell you the date. Finally, note in the distance the mausoleum of Augustus, the great dynastic tomb of Augustus, which Augustus also added to this general area of the Campus Martius. I mentioned that the video shows one of two simulations that we've made. The version you've just seen is photorealistic. We use it to present the results of our research when our research is all finished. It's not interactive. The second simulation, which can be seen in this slide, was created in an abstract style. It's not photorealistic at all. In contrast to the first simulation you've just seen, it uses the game engine Unity and thus is interactive and can even be published on the internet. And we're going to publish it in my journal next year, I hope, if the reviewers think our article is good, which I hope they will. One of its main features is that it permits us to change the time of day on a minute-by-minute basis over the 40-year period from 9 BC, when these monuments were first erected, to 40 AD. Here you're seeing us change the sun and the sky. The sun and the sky were modeled with the same concern for accuracy as those features on the ground. We surveyed the meridian, the obelisk, the Areopagus to get their position and their size exactly right. The sky we could get from NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, which has a database called the Horizon System, which gives you the position and relative size of the sun, the moon, and over 3,000 objects in the solar system for the whole period from 9,999 before Christ to 9,999 AD. Modeling the position of the sun in the sky in this way is very necessary if the alignment of interest to you involves the sun, which, as we will see, it certainly does in our study. The sun's apparent course through the sky is constantly changing because the Earth wobbles as it rotates. Over the 2,000 years separating us from the reign of Augustus, the sun's course has changed so much that autopsy, going to Rome and looking at these monuments and looking at the sky, would be useless because the sun's in a different place just as much as those monuments are in a different place. So again, we must have a computer simulation if we want to tackle this question at all. Why is the study of the alignment between the sun, Areopagus, and Montecitorio obelisk interesting to us as Roman archaeologists? The answer is simple. There we go. In 1976, a German historian named Edmund Buchner proposed a theory that has dominated research on these important monuments for the past 40 years. Buchner was an ancient historian. In 1976, he published an article in which, for the first time, someone postulated a meaningful alignment between the Areopagus and the Montecitorio obelisk. To test his theory, he undertook field work for several years, starting in 1979. In 1980, his excavations uncovered the meridian seen in this slide. So that is the meridian that I showed you in the computer simulation. Buchner found it, or found part of it. He found 6.5 meters of the 55 meters. This was a spectacular discovery. It received worldwide media coverage, and it made it possible for Buchner himself to become the first non-archaeologist ever to become president of the German Archaeological Institute, headquartered in Berlin, with branches in many cities important for archaeology around the world, including Rome, Athens, Cairo, and Istanbul. Buchner always promised to publish a final report about his project, but he didn't live long enough to do so. He died in 2012. His personal papers just became available for study at the German Institute's branch in Munich. And earlier this month, last month I have to say, because we're now in December, and I was there in November, I was the first scholar to be granted permission to consult this archive. Buchner repeatedly claimed in publications starting in 1980 that his excavations proved the correctness of the theory he proposed back in 1976 before undertaking any field work. But is this really true? That's what I want to talk to you about today. My team used our new interactive computer simulation to test the validity of Buchner's theory. So let me briefly tell you what that theory is. The first concerns the setup of the monuments. Buchner thought that there was a sphere on top of the obelisk because it served as the pointer not just for the meridian that gives you the noon hour every day, but it served as the pointer for a vast sundial that gives you all the hours of the day, or the hours of daylight anyway of the day. And this sundial would have been the biggest in world history, inscribed on a travertine pavement 160 by 75 meters in size. The Areopagus and the altar were aligned so that the midpoint of the Areopagus was on an extension of the equinoctial line of this hypothesized sundial. The second claim concerns the environmental effect that inevitably results from the setup of the monuments, if Buchner is right, namely that on Augustus's birthday, there is a shadow cast by the obelisk all day long that moves along the equinoctial line right to the middle of the Areopagus. Buchner thought that Augustus's birthday was September 23rd, which is not exactly the equinox 2,000 years ago. That was the 25th, but it's close enough that the shadow of the obelisk does move pretty close to that line. So his theory is right, even though the birthday is not quite the equinox. The third claim is that the effect of the shadow going into the middle of the Areopagus was to propagate implicitly the message that Augustus was born to bring peace, or as Buchner put it in Latin, natus ad pacem, born to bring peace. In the next slide, we see Buchner's own illustration of his theory. You can see the obelisk, the monumental plaza of the sundial, and the Areopagus. You see the shadow reaching the equinoctial line on Augustus's birthday, and then proceeding along that line right into the Areopagus, which the illustration doesn't show, but you have to imagine that yourself. As everyone in this room knows, it is risky to undertake an excavation to prove a pre-existing theory. The real world is a messy place. Very often it does not conform to what historical logic or our historical imagination might lead us to expect. The case we are considering was, unfortunately for Edmund Buchner, as we will see, no exception to this rule. First of all, despite taking soundings all over the area of his hypothesized monumental pavement, Buchner never found any trace of paving stones. So he did 14 cores in this area. He never found any evidence of travertine pavement at the Augustan quota level. Even what he did find, his dramatic discovery of the meridian, caused serious problems for his theory. First, the meridian and its pavement were positioned 1.8 meters higher than the level of the Areopagus, which Buchner knew was the Augustan level in this part of Rome. So it's too high. Second, the meridian was some 4 meters to the west and 2 meters to the south of where Buchner had predicted it would be in 1976, before he discovered it. So Buchner had some, and so that means, of course, that the Areopagus is not going to be on the equinoctial line. It's going to be 2 meters south of the equinoctial line, as we will see. So Buchner had some serious problems to confront. He dealt with them by revising his theory to postulate 2 phases of the monument: the Augustan, and then a second phase, which he dated to the Flavian period, so roughly 69 AD to 96 AD, some decades after the death of Augustus, when the Flavian emperors ruled Rome. Buchner reasoned this way. We know from an ancient author, Pliny, writing about 60 years after Augustus's death, that the sphere atop the obelisk was no longer giving accurate time. We also know from what Buchner found that the meridian is not at the right place or in the right level. So what must have happened, according to Buchner, is that after that writer was writing and saying that this no longer worked, so roughly in 70 AD, a later emperor, probably a Flavian emperor, 75, 80, 85, 90, one of those emperors in one of those years fixed the meridian, fixed the whole sundial by raising the level, changing the position of the obelisk, and recalibrating the sundial. That was what Buchner had imagined would happen. And of course, the reason why we're at a higher level is that in this intervening period of many decades, the Tiber River had continued to flood every 5 or 10 years and left alluvial deposits all around the Campus Martius, raising the ground level, we know, around the Areopagus by about 1.5 to 1.8 meters. So the ground level was higher, and therefore the meridian and the whole sundial had to be higher, according to Buchner. Very logical and very possible, but as we'll see, it's just not true. Buchner wrote in 1980 that his revised theory could be confirmed if only he could turn over one of the pavement stones that he found under the meridian line that we saw in the earlier slide. His idea was that the Flavian emperors wouldn't have brought in new building materials, new pavers and new bronze lines and new bronze inscriptions. They would have reused what Augustus already had used in the earlier phase of the monument. And his idea that in reusing the earlier material, that the Flavians would have had to flip everything upside down to have a fresh surface on which to nail down the lines and the inscriptions in bronze. 1 year later, in 1981, Buchner published a follow-up report in which he stated that for technical reasons, it was not possible to turn over all these pavers to test his theory. Buchner's theory was widely accepted by Roman archaeologists and historians. From the first, there were dissenters, but they never got much of a hearing, undoubtedly in part because the shadow theory required complex astronomical calculations, which in the days before personal computers, you had to do yourself by hand. Very few archaeologists were qualified to make such calculations, or if they were willing to, because it's quite tedious. And in the area in question, there are 2.5 trillion possible moments of alignment between the sun, the Areopagus, and the obelisk. 2.5 trillion. So even if you do one calculation, and maybe you test Buchner's idea and it doesn't work, and then you want to find out another calculation that would work, you have over 2.5 trillion other calculations to make. It's impossible, and it's very depressing. So nobody tried, and everyone just relied upon Buchner. And of course, there was the fact that Buchner never published his final report despite promising to do so, so it was never possible to independently see his raw data and determine whether his interpretations of the raw data were cogent. In 2013, everything changed, with the publication of a monograph by an engineer and gnomonist, a designer of sundials, in Trieste, Italy, named Paolo Alberi Aubert. Alberi Aubert worked just with the archaeological facts that could be known from Buchner's many publications. He used the facts and discarded the theories and tried to see if there could be a new theory constructed on these facts. He subjected the facts to critical review and proposed a new interpretation. First of all, the sphere atop the obelisk was not the pointer of the biggest sundial in world history. It simply provided a shadow for the meridian that Buchner found. Note that while all sundials have meridians, obviously every sundial which shows all the hours of daylight will have a line for noon, that's the meridian. Not all meridians are sundials. Some meridians are just meridians, they just give you noon. So suddenly, there was no need for Buchner's monumental plaza, 160 by 75 meters in size, a plaza for which Buchner and his 14 cores never found any evidence anyway. And Alberi Aubert noted that, in fact, Buchner himself stated and admitted that he never found any evidence or proof of the existence of this pavement. Secondly, the meridian and the obelisk had just one phase, not two, and that phase was Augustan. But why then is the meridian and its pavement 1.8 meters higher than the pavement of the Areopagus, which is surely Augustan? Alberi Aubert states that the reason is not chronological but architectural. The Augustans built the meridian at this higher level to give it some protection against the periodic flooding of the Tiber River. Finally, Alberi Aubert thought that Augustus had two motives for creating this monumental complex. First, there was the ideological reason for visually tying together the Areopagus and the Montecitorio obelisk. Albert Aubert, being an engineer and a gnomonist, not an archaeologist, felt unqualified to offer the ideological interpretation for this, but he said, undoubtedly, the original motivation behind this alignment that Augustus put in was propagandistic. It was ideological. But he did address the second motive, which he called scientific. If the monument was simply a meridian, not a sundial, then it was not useful as a device to tell the time of day, but merely to know when it was noon on a particular day of the year. Why do you need a monumental sundial, monumental meridian, to tell you this fact, which would seem fairly obvious? We just look at our wristwatch. Whoops, here's my wristwatch. To find out, and the Romans had sundials all over the city. They could have just looked at one of them. They had a reason. Which I will get to in a second. Okay. Albert Aubert noted a passage in an ancient author in which the answer to the question could have been given. By constructing a meridian that was 55 meters long, such as Augustus did in the Campus Martius, it was possible to keep track not only of noon, that's easy, but the leap years. The anno bisestile in Italiano. How do you say that leap year in Spanish? Bisiesto. To keep track of the bisiesto. This is because each year in the cycle of years from one leap year to the next, the position of the sun's shadow changes slightly. With a large enough instrument working at a big enough scale, you can magnify this difference, which is so slight as to be almost imperceptible on a normal sundial this big, to the point where it can be observed with the naked eye. Quoting the ancient author, Albert Aubert calls this procedure the observatio umbrarum, or the observation of shadows. The segment of our video seen in the slide illustrates the procedure. So there's the Montecitorio obelisk, there's the sphere on top. You see the shadow of the obelisk on the meridian, and you see the shadow of the sphere projected onto the date of April 23rd, 11 AD. Now we're going to go to 12 AD. We're going to jump a year. The shadow is moved. You can see that at this big scale. You couldn't see that shift on a small normal sundial. And what we'll also see as we continue watching the simulation is that in the fourth year, the shadow will return to where it was in 11 AD. So now we're in our third year, and now we're in our fourth year. We're in the leap year, and it's back to where it started. Now, you might think that observing the leap year is an easy matter. And for us, of course, it is very easy to know when we have a leap year. But if you think yourself back into the shoes, or maybe I should say the sandals of a Roman of the age of Augustus, the matter was not so easy. First of all, the Romans had only had the leap year, the concept of the leap year, for 36 years by 12 BC. It had been introduced by Augustus's father by adoption, his great-uncle by birth, Julius Caesar, giving us the Caesarian calendar. Caesarian calendar is 365 and a quarter days. It has the leap year. It was the first calendar in human history to have the leap year. Unfortunately, the Romans didn't know how to count. As you know, famously, they didn't have zero. That only came in the Middle Ages. And so when a Roman had to count to 4, he already was on 1. So he said, all right, we're on 1, 2, 3, 4. But only 3 years have gone by. So in the 36 years between the introduction of the Julian calendar by Julius Caesar and Augustus's day, 12 BC, instead of observing the leap year 9 times, so you divide 36 years by 4, you get 9, they had observed it 12 times, 36 divided by 3. And the calendar was already wrong. So this was a problem for them. Seems silly to us, but it was a real problem. So according to Albert Aubert, it was to avoid making this mistake in the future that Augustus built the monumental meridian. The observation of the shadows made it possible simply to look and see when the shadow of the sphere had returned to its starting point in the leap year cycle. So you didn't have to be a mathematician to know when to add that extra day for the leap year. What are we to make of Albert-Aubert's new theory? Well, first of all, the newly available Buchner archive, which I have already mentioned, where I studied the papers last month, reveals something quite interesting. Despite what Buchner published in 1981, he actually did turn over some of the pavement of the meridian. I found an album of color pictures last month that contains these shots. You see a big saw there, a big saw that can cut through concrete or travertine stone. There's the saw working. You see, we're on the meridian. You can see the inscriptions in the line. Now they've cut out a piece. There's Edmund Buchner himself. He can't say he wasn't there. And there's the bottom of that piece that they cut out. It's unfinished. It's rough. That means the whole theory of the Flavian phase is wrong. There was no Flavian phase, and Albert-Aubert is correct. So Buchner did turn over one of the paver blocks and saw that the bottom side was unfinished. Thus, his theory of the two phases with reuse of the same pavers in the second phase turned upside down was not verified. This adds credence to Albert-Aubert's new interpretation that there was just one phase, and that phase was Augustan. This has dramatic consequences for Buchner's theory. He can no longer explain why the meridian is in the wrong place and at the wrong level. It turns out, as we see in the slide, that the middle of the Areopagus is not on an extension of the equinoctial line. So here's where Buchner put it, boom, right to the middle, but actually where the equinoctial line would come into the Areopagus is 2 meters south of that. But there was no equinoctial line, because to have an equinoctial line you needed a pavement, and we've already seen there was no pavement. So the whole issue is moot. Buchner was focusing on the wrong way of tying these monuments together. More importantly, the meridian line and the obelisk are 4 meters west of where Buchner hypothesized in 1976. So here's where Buchner put the line, and here's where he actually found it. Remember, now we're saying that what he found is that line he was looking for. It's not the Flavian rebuild at a slightly different level in a different place. It is the Augustan level, and it's 4 meters to the west. This means that it is farther away from the Areopagus. So its shadow has to travel farther to reach the facade of the Areopagus to the east. In fact, as our interactive simulation shows, the shadow did not reach into the middle of the Areopagus on Augustus's birthday. Instead, as you see in this slide, which is a screenshot of our interactive simulation, it hits the facade to the left or to the south. As we say in English, close but no cigar. Our interactive simulation isn't just capable of producing such negative results. Since it supports virtual time travel, it also facilitates empirical, or as I like to say, simpirical research. For months, we used the simulation to move around the virtual Campus Martius while changing the date and time of day as we moved. Eventually, it dawned on us that what Buchner expected to find on Augustus's birthday of September 23rd actually does happen. In fact, it doesn't just, you see it right here in the slide. You clearly have the shadow of the obelisk going all the way into the middle of the Areopagus. It doesn't just happen on one day, it happens on 48 days of the year. In fact, it happens on so many days of the year that it probably has no significance whatsoever. Because to be significant, to be driving this alignment, it has, I think everybody would agree, it has to be a rare phenomenon, not a fairly common one. So it has to be so rare that it really is striking, is salient, and you can't miss it when it happens. The assumption behind Buchner's work is that the environmental effect was only significant if it was rare. Buchner himself says that. It had to occur so infrequently each year that when it did, it was salient and made the viewer feel a sense of religious awe. Clearly something that happens 48 days of the year does not meet this criterion. So if we want to go beyond Buchner, we need to find a different environmental effect. It should happen on a religious holiday or perhaps on a date important to the life of Augustus, like his birthday, the birthday of his wife. We know he dedicated the Areopagus on the birthday of his wife, Livia, in 9 BC, January 30th. Some date like that. At this point in our work, it occurred to us that we should be looking at the sun, not at the shadow cast by the sun. So instead of following Buchner and trying to tie the obelisk and Areopagus together by viewing the obelisk's shadow projected onto the west facade, which we see here, of the Areopagus, we had the idea of moving east of the Areopagus and looking west toward the Areopagus and the obelisk. So getting this view from a major public road on which the Areopagus is located. In fact, looking at the sun from this position had three obvious advantages. First, it meant we were looking at both the Areopagus and the obelisk at the same time. With Buchner's theory, we're looking only at the Areopagus. We have our back to the obelisk. Second, it meant that we were looking at what all archaeologists have long since recognized is the principal facade of the Areopagus, which is the eastern side facing the major public highway, the Via Flaminia that we're standing on in this rendering. Finally, so that's the road where people are. The other side is a field of weeds. There's nothing on the other side particularly. There's no reason why you would be there to look at the shadow. Finally, we were taking into account the fact that the obelisk is explicitly dedicated to the sun god, as the surviving dedicatory inscription states, to quote, Emperor Caesar Augustus gave this as a gift to the sun god. Imperator Caesar Augustus soli donum dedit. So we might well expect the sun and not its shadow to be the key element of the alignment. Thinking about how all of these elements might be visually connected in a way that is axial and visually awe-inspiring, it occurred to us that what we might be looking for is a moment when the sun's disk seems to be tangent to the top of the obelisk. In other words, we wondered if the simulation might find a date or a handful of dates with religious significance where something axial like the following happens. Does that ever happen? It is hard to imagine a more impressive and appropriate way to align the sun, the obelisk, and the Areopagus. So we next determined to find out whether some such thing ever happens. In the video on the screen, you see us positioned in the right place to the east of the Areopagus on the public road as we change the date and time and watch the behavior of the sun in the sky. Each of these movements of the sun would require that calculation that I showed you on the earlier slide. It would take you hours to make each of those, remember, 2.5 trillion calculations. By having the simulation, the computer does all that for you automatically in real time whenever you need it. After many hours of searching, we found that, in fact, there were 3 dates that meet these criteria. The dates are March 14th, when there's a festival known as the Aquaria, October 7th, with 2 festivals, one to Juno, one to Jupiter, and October 9th, with a holiday honoring the god Apollo. We were happy to find that what we thought could be impressive and awe-inspiring actually occurred. We didn't know that. In fact, nobody knew that when you stood on the public road, you could even see the obelisk. In the entire scholarly literature, that is never mentioned. I certainly never imagined it. So we were happy to see all these things made possible only by a simpirical approach. And we were happy to see that in contrast to Buchner's 48 days, when his shadow is in the right place, for our effect, it happens on only 3 days. So that's, I think you could say, a rare event. And we wondered then if one of these dates was the key, driving the whole design by Augustus and his architects to set up the obelisk in the right place with respect to the Areopagus. we could find no cogent reason for supporting the Aquaria festival or the holidays for Jupiter and Juno on October 7th. In contrast, the festival for Apollo on October 9th made perfect sense. And let me explain briefly why. And it's not just any cult of Apollo. In Rome, there are several cults of Apollo in different parts of the city. This is specifically the cult of Apollo Palatinus, Apollo on the Palatine Hill. First of all, just as Augustus built the Areopagus and brought the obelisk to Rome, so too he was the person responsible for the construction of the temple of Apollo Palatinus. In this slide, you see where the monuments of interest to us are in the ancient city. As we have seen, in the northern part of the city stood the Areopagus and the obelisk in the square box, and where we have the blue arrow in the center of the city on the Palatine Hill stood the Temple of Apollo. Let's take a closer look at the Temple of Apollo. Again, the blue arrow points out where it is. And let's put a circle around what is next to the Temple of Apollo. None other than the house of the Emperor Augustus. He built the Temple of Apollo right next to his house. Topography, as you well know from the sites you study, often reflects mentality and ideology. Such is certainly the case here. The fact that the Temple of Apollo is right next to Augustus's house is not accidental. In fact, we know that of all the gods in the Greek and Roman pantheon, Augustus was especially drawn to Apollo and especially reverenced Apollo, whom he considered his special tutelary or protecting deity. This comes across in many ways in the ancient sources. For example, we see in this slide that Augustus's biographer Suetonius tells us that Augustus had a story circulated according to which he was even called the son of Apollo. In order to drive home this point, Augustus was often portrayed with the features of Apollo. One such statue, showing Apollo looking like Augustus, was precisely located in the Temple of Apollo Palatinus, not surprisingly. This statue is lost, but we have other surviving evidence, for example, this engraved gem in Naples, which shows Apollo with the features of Augustus. Moreover, Apollo was the Roman sun god. Apollo was the sun god. This connection with the sun is of obvious relevance for our problem. You will recall that the obelisk is dedicated to the sun god, and indeed the Egyptians and Romans thought that obelisks symbolized sunbeams. So such a dedication was very apt. In building the Temple of Apollo Palatinus, Augustus stressed precisely this solar aspect of the cult of Apollo. Thus, we hear in a literary source that on the roof of the temple stood a gilded statue of the sun god riding his chariot through the sky. This monument does not exist, but again, we have an engraved gem in Naples. Sorry, the other engraved gem is in Florence, as you've seen. This one's in Naples, which actually from the collection of Giacomo de' Medici, if anyone's interested in its history. And this shows Augustus in the guise of the sun god. And it may even be an illustration of that gilded chariot on the roof of the Temple of Apollo Palatinus. Meanwhile, the white blocks of the temple's superstructure were painted, we now know from studies by Heinrich Piening, a conservation scientist in Munich. They were painted in yellow and orange to emphasize the solar aspect of the cult of Apollo. And you can see in this rendering that chariot of the sun god, gilded chariot of the sun god, on top of the temple. So very solar cult. Finally, the decorative iconography of the Areopagus has long been recognized to include a strong Apolline element. In particular, the lower register of painted reliefs running all around the monument is decorated with acanthus leaves and swans. Both the plants and the bird, the swan, were common symbols of Apollo. And since the 19th century, art historians have said, yeah, that's Apollo. That's how Augustus is showing us that Apollo is his favorite god by decorating the lower register of the Areopagus all the way around with these symbols of Apollo. In the next slide, we see our moment of discovery of the October 9th alignment using the interactive simulation. And this is what Roman worshippers might have seen each October 9th when they stood on the public road, the Via Flaminia, and stood on the axis of symmetry of the east entrance of the Areopagus, saw the obelisk also on an extension of that axis of symmetry in the distance, and saw the sun seemingly right on top of the obelisk. I think you will agree that the simulation not only appeals to our intellect because it satisfies the rules of investigation that we inferred from earlier work by Buchner and others on the problem, but it also arouses our emotions of admiration for the ancient scientist whose calculations were precise enough to determine how to arrange the monuments to get this effect on the right day of the year. The ideological message conveyed by the alignment is not that Augustus was born to bring peace, as Buchner thought, but rather that Augustus was a kind of sun god, ruling on earth with the blessing and help of his father, the Roman sun god Apollo. I end with the prediction that simpirical study, such as the one I presented today, will become more and more common as archaeologists move beyond seeing 3D technology simply as a tool for documenting artifacts, archaeological sites the way they are today, and illustrating that knowledge for their own purposes and for purposes of education. But as they start to use 3D models in this way as tools for new insights and discovery, the 3D model can itself become a scientific tool to generate new knowledge that would otherwise have been impossible absent real-time travel. Certainly in the case of Mesoamerican archaeology in Mexico and elsewhere, the topics of celestial alignments of important religious structures is nothing new. The kind of simpirical approach I presented today can be applied to confirm or disconfirm alignments already proposed in the scientific literature on Mexican archaeology. To take just one recent example, Eleanor Harrison Buck has recently disputed the claim by Aveni and others that the Caracol building at Chichen Itza was used to make astronomical observations. It would not surprise me to find that in your field, too, simpiricism can make a contribution to clearing up scholarly controversies and to generating new ideas and insights about the archaeological data themselves. And I hasten to add that simpiricism doesn't just mean archaeoastronomy. It can mean any simulation of any feature of a past site. How many people could get into a building, how long it took them to get in and out. We did such a simpirical study of the Colosseum in Rome. That has nothing to do with the sun or the moon or the stars. That's purely based upon measuring something that happens in a built feature on Earth. That's a simpirical study too. You can extend simpiricism to include experiential studies. So we did a study of Hadrian's Villa, the government retreat to the east of Rome, where we simulated not only the environment, but also members of the court who were played by avatars. And we simulated various ideas that scholars had about how members of the court interacted with Hadrian, whether petitioners coming from a city or a province around the empire and asking for something, or members of the court deliberating on how to make a budget. All of these things could be simulated in the same way, in the same spirit of simpiricism, but for experiential reasons that we've seen in this study. So don't think of simpiricism as limited to archaeoastronomy. It goes way beyond that. So I conclude by expressing the hope that you will find our case study in Rome to be useful to your own work here in Mexico. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bernie. I think it was a very inspiring talk, and as you said, I think Mexico has a very important field on empirical methods applied not to just archaeological sites, but monuments and other, even museums could be using these techniques. Due to our delay, I will encourage you to follow the talk with our colleagues outside to follow up with next talks. And a todos ustedes, gracias por estar y bueno, no dejar en el aire las palabras de invitación de Bernie de quizá incluir sus papers o sus modelos en 3D en su revista digital. Creo que es una excelente oportunidad y al mismo tiempo, pues bueno, también abrió una invitación a quien pueda ser el representante mesoamericano en el board de la publicación. Así que bueno, si hay alguien interesado, pues ahí está la invitación. Muchas gracias y los invitamos a seguir, si lo quieren abordar y exprimir su conocimiento allá afuera, pues adelante, seguiremos con la siguiente mesa. Muchas gracias.